ICQ Podcast Episode 255, The Art of Desoldering. Well, hello fellow Amateur Radio enthusiasts and welcome to this, our 255th episode of the ICQ Amateur Radio Podcast, supported by Kevin Murphy, Whiskey 8 Victor Oscar Sierra, and our monthly and annual subscription donors. In this episode, I'm joined by Martin M1MRB, Edmund Mike 0 Mike November Golf, and Bill November 3 Juliet India X-Ray to discuss the latest amateur radio news. I then round up the news in brief, and it's followed on then by our features episode, which is the Art of Desoldering. As always, it's our donors that keep the show advert free and pays our way on the internet. And for this episode, along with our subscription donors, we'd like to thank Kevin Murphy, Whiskey 8 Victor Oscar Sierra from New Boston in Michigan. And Kevin sends a little note saying he enjoys listening to the show while travelling in his car commuting on the airline. It makes the time go faster. Keep up the great work, and 73. So thanks a lot for that great feedback, Kevin, and we really appreciate that you enjoy the show. You can do your bit as well to help keep us advert free just by visiting www.icqpodcast.com/donate, where anything you can send our way is always greatly appreciated. Well, now, Martin, Edmund, and Bill join myself to discuss the latest amateur radio news, including school ham radio discussions and Earth, Moon, Earth on 10 watts. I hope you enjoy. Well, everybody, welcome to this episode 255's ICQ Roundtable. Colin here, M6BOY, chairing the roundtable in this episode. But don't fear, we do have Martin here. Martin M1MRB, my father. You're joining us on the other side of the roundtable this episode, Dad. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm on the dark side tonight. Then.
You're on the dark side, yeah. I'll be the side of the good, and you be the side of evil. But hopefully to keep you in check, we've got Edmund Spicer, Mike 0 Mike November Golf. Edmund, great to catch up with you again. Hope everything's well.
No chance of me keeping Martin in check. Hello there, Colin. Hello, everybody.
And from the States, Bill Barnes, November 3, Julia India X-Ray. Bill, great to catch up with you again. Hope everything's well your side of the pond.
It is. Thank you for asking, and good evening to everyone.
Wonderful, wonderful. Right, let's get this show on the road, as they say, and we start off here with news of clubs in the States getting involved demonstrating ham radio to kids in schools. So, Bill, your side of the world here, this is another great example, isn't it, the fact of promoting the hobby to aspiring kids that we can bring into the hobby.
Yeah, this one was an interesting one. The Pocahontas County High School in West Virginia invited some of the members from the Eight Rivers Ham Radio Club into their school for the science, technology, engineering, math, STEM activities to talk about radio, and got to give them an introduction to radio and amateur radio, which is really nice when the schools invite clubs in, and it's really great that the clubs took their time out and sent some folks over to help them out.
Yeah, as I say, I think this is always one of those great stories, isn't it? The fact of showing that by the end. Obviously, STEM, obviously in the States, is science, technology, English and maths, isn't it? If I remember rightly, the STEM, but it's all about those core technologies there. And I know heading back to the UK side of things, I know, Dad, there's a lot that goes on as well with scout groups and things on those lines, really, to continue this promotion, isn't there?
Yeah, and the STEM is also in the UK. I think it's a worldwide thing, but it works quite well. The interesting one here, from my point of view, is as long as we tailor it for the right audience, and one of my biggest soapbox is that you can't just turn up with the £6,000 Icon, Kenwood, Yaesu, whatever it is, and sit there and scream and holler and use it as a way of working DX. You've got to interface with people. And I remember, and I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but I remember doing a cub, which are junior scouts, a day, activity day, and we gave up doing amateur radio fairly quickly because we were down in this bowl. We had a number of license-free radios, and we issued them, and the children went off playing. And we said, right, you got it for half an hour, you have to bring it back in half an hour's time, somebody else can have a go. And literally, we had people actually doing radio and enjoying radio and playing with radio. And that to me is, setting the enjoyment. Now, okay, I mean, that's not amateur radio, but it's an enjoyment and losing the fear of using a walkie-talkie or handy-talkie, Colin, I'd suggest.
Yeah, it goes back to the same thing, though, doesn't it? In fact, is it keep it simple and it brings people on board. And I'm sure you've got experience as well, Edmund, haven't you, about bringing people that are non-amateurs into the hobby just by showing them the simple pleasures of communication of a radio.
Absolutely. So many young people who I've met, if you give them a license-free handheld, will happily use it and think it's something quite exciting and wonderful and different, even though it's a lot more low-tech than their very expensive smartphones, for example. And certainly in England anyway, you can pick up some license-free radios at car boot sales. I seem to go to rather a lot of car boot sales these days. It's one of my wife's hobbies, and I get the privilege of escorting her pretty much every weekend. And it's been quite noticeable in the last couple of years how many of these little devices are on sale now. Only one thing to be careful of: if you're in the UK or Europe and you buy a license-free radio at something like a boot sale or even online, just make sure that it is one that operates on the 446 megahertz license-free band, because I've seen an increasing number in the last couple of years that have been imported from the US and operate on the FRS or GMRS frequencies up on 462 or 467 megahertz. So just be a little bit careful of that. That seems to become a lot more common these last couple of years. And the other thing is, it's nice to see in the article here that not only do the interested students get shown amateur radio, they then are also presented with the opportunity of studying for a technician license for the FCC, and they also get given a handheld radio. I wonder if it's a cheapy but very nice Baofeng BF888S, which I think has been talked about a few years back on this very podcast, hasn't it? The idea of giving those away and locking them to certain local simplex and repeater frequencies and giving them to people to listen before they pass the test, and then when they do pass the test, unlocking them putting them into transmit mode as well as receive, which I think is a great idea. So I think it was you, Martin, that mooted that idea a few years back. Perhaps they listened to that podcast and paid attention to your idea.
Well, I think that, everybody initially goes, oh, let's do HF. But when you're new into the hobby, or you're showing the public, listening to SSB signals is quite difficult. And often us amateurs are a bit lazy and we don't tune it in correctly. And, it's just, and the background noise there. And it just seems sometimes too difficult, whereas a nice handy talkie, it gets them started very, very quickly, and they can hear, and their ears are tuned to that sort of quality of audio. Don't you think, Bill?
Yes, I do agree as well. It really does matter what you give them if they're not used to listen to it.
Yeah. And not only that as well, but the from a parental point of view, or for people on low income, whether it be, it's a very cheap way of getting into the hobby. And so there's no barrier. If you like, cost isn't a barrier for getting involved in the hobby. And obviously, when they get involved and they're interested with be, then there's obviously second-hand market and boot sales and donations, all sorts of things. But it's a great way of getting people in, isn't it? So, no, I'd agree with a lot of that logic there. As always, ICQpodcast.com about the stories in relation to this one, and maybe get some ideas of how your club can drum up some interest locally around. Yeah. So worthwhile checking those things out.
I think it's good, Colin, that clubs are doing this to schools. So I'm not knocking the club, but just feeling as long as they promote the hobby or promote radio in the way that your audience are going to go with it, I think it's a good thing. And I'd like to see more clubs, both sides of the pond, doing this.
Well, moving on to the next story now. And in Canada, they're looking at the distractions of driving. Now, I know there's been a lot of stuff in this, Edmund, in relation now to obviously mobile phones and smartphones, things on those lines. And Canada's Ontario district is proposing a new law that looks like it's going to exempt handheld radio use as part of that law.
Yes, and to make life even more interesting than it is in the UK, it seems like different parts of Canada have different rules about what is and isn't acceptable behind the wheel. My feeling is really that, speaking as somebody who doesn't operate mobile at all, unless I'm parked up somewhere, if the police pull you over, then it's all well and good being able to argue the toss over legislation and what it says and what it means and what it doesn't mean, and oh, well, this is all right because it's a radio transmitter on an amateur band rather than a mobile phone that's higher in frequency. If they're so minded, they'll just do you in this country for driving without due care and attention anyway. So my gut feeling is, rather than getting caught up in the details, it's probably easier just to not be on the radio while you're driving, really. That's the cop-out answer from my end.
I mean, that's certainly the case that from a UK perspective, I never fully understand what the actual rules are in relation to using, phones or radios, whatever it be, be it hands-free kits and, Bluetooth and talking to them and all that sort of stuff. It always seems to be very open. And as Edmund says, the fact is there's always seems to be a catch-all law there to get you anyway if they want to.
Yeah, the mobile phone laws is something different. You're not allowed to be using a mobile phone while you're driving unless it's via a hands-free kit to just take calls. Re-amateur radio, technically, and as Edmund says, technically you could use the microphone, the PTT microphone, but in fairness, it's a horrible experience. I've done both. I've used a mic and driven. And you can do it, and I've got an automatic car at the moment, so that's not too bad. But I always used to chat to Chris Howard on a Monday night, leaving the club when I was leaving the club later than I do these days. And Chris would always pass it back to me. I don't know how he did it, but he always passed it back to me as I was approaching this big roundabout. And if you're not on a hands-free, you're fumbling. So you're not driving particularly well. So you can get done by driving without due care and attention. But I did a feature or a number of episodes ago, which was how to make a very, very simple hands-free kit for the car, or wired hands-free kit. Dead simple, only costs a few pounds to make in a previous episode. I've built a number of these. You've used both of them in both of your mum's car and mine, Colin. So you've always operated hands-free mobile, haven't you?
Yeah, and to be honest, the systems that you've pulled together have always been very easy to use and, are very natural as well, for your driving position. So, it doesn't distract at all away from what you're doing. So, no, definitely, you have to take some pictures sometime. We'll have to stick them up on the website sometime. There you go. Yeah. There's a job for you to do. So no boss. Bill, heading over there to the States then. So, obviously Canada, your northern neighbours there. I'm sure there's interest of what's going on there. I mean, obviously different states, different, rules, I'm sure, throughout the States, but how do you see this affecting things, in your part of the world?
As I was reading this was kind of interesting. The one thing is that they still haven't replied to the Canadian, RAC yet. But they're expecting to do it before January 1st, 2018. So we'll see how it works out for Canada. When I started clicking on the stuff for Canada, I started falling into stuff for, how it works in the United States. Pennsylvania's had a ban on texting while driving since 2005, something like that. And the one thing that I found out, which I did not know, I knew there was a ham radio exception in 2013, but it's use of handheld radios by persons with FCC amateur radio station license in emergency response situations and for emergency response purposes. So I'm going to, recommend everybody I talk to, do a hands-free, kit in their car so that they don't have to use a speaker mic or use a handheld. The other thing is I found out that these are slowly getting homogenized into various states, because I found a small article about if the state wants to get certain cash from the Federal National Highway Traffic Safety Administration grants, they have to have this kind of law in place with no exceptions except the emergency response exception. Maybe that's why all the repeaters are less busy than they used to be. I don't know. That makes me wonder. I also found an article when I was reading through all this stuff from the ARRL. November 2013 QST, it seems to us, talks about the effects of this in Connecticut and what David Sumner tried to do back then. Interesting read. There's a lot of interesting read. The RAC article is very interesting. The ARRL article is very interesting. And I ended up looking at my own state up. Very, very interesting little subject that I recommend everybody take a few minutes and go read and figure out what your state laws are for sure.
Exactly. I mean, as you say, it is one of those ones you say, you look at it and you think, well, I'm not really doing much wrong, etc. I'm a licensed amateur and I'm correct to say to arrest it. But as you say, I'm sure there's blanket laws there that you can be caught up in if you're not careful. So it's worthwhile checking out your regional laws there. We'll put the information about the Canadian stuff, obviously on the ICQ podcast website, but it'd be worthwhile checking out your own region as well. Probably good practice there as part of your license condition check, actually, those sort of things as well. Right, move on to the next one here, and this is an interesting blog post we're linking to here, which is talking about the future of amateur radio. This is aimed at what they class as the millennials and the youth of today. But it talks about, Bill here, an interesting idea about remote stations.
Yeah, Sterling Coffee N0SSC had a very good and interesting blog post the other week on his blog. Yes, he had a great clickbait title to drag you in, but he's, as someone who's 25 and, really interested in how things work and how, what's a hobby going to look like in 20, 30, 40 years, he put a lot of thought processes through, and he actually went through and described a few things, that I think are just great ideas to start, just to kind of understand what's going on. The whole idea about the maker movement, homebrewing's on the decline somewhat. He talks about that a little bit. He talks about the kids love digital modes. Nope. And he talks about that whole thing, which once again, that kind of matches what we're hearing here as we go past. He talks about the next big things for ham radio. The first one that he talks into is the remote operating for HF. This is the one I'm willing to put my money on. Around here where I live, there's a whole bunch of repeater clubs, and it's fairly common for people that want to take care of a repeater to be repeater keepers, that they get together as a club to pool resources because they tend to be expensive proposition. I'm expecting in the next 5 to 25 years to see remote operating clubs show up where they take these locations such as a repeater site that's RF quiet, put up HF antennas, put up a remote radio system, and then club members can remote in across the internet and access that radio. Maybe because of HOA restrictions, maybe because of RF restrictions with just the noise that we've been talking about off and on that happens to be polluting the airwaves. I really think he's dead on with that we're gonna see more and more of that. Another thing that he proposed in his little blog post was the ham radio hackathons. And this is just, I'd like to go just to see what they're talking about. It really seems an interesting concept. The idea of getting together, conference, and just, having like a contest, like working out a problem. Even just the social aspects of getting together like that to work on a problem for a few days at a conference, I think that would be really, really interesting. He also dissects, age groups, when he sees, what kind of hams we end up getting out of certain age groups, from his point of view, which is very interesting. I match the 14 to 18 group when I got in, and so that kind of stayed the same. So I thought the whole blog post is definitely worth anyone's time to go read. And it's, n0ssc.com. And, Colin, I'm sure you're going to put a link in the ICQ podcast for us. And then it's a really good, interesting, thought-provoking blog post.
Yeah, there's some stuff I quite like as well. I quite like the idea of minimalizing the resources into central locations and people using them and getting more return out of them. Other industries like the IT industry, etc., we pool resources and we utilize things more effectively. And potentially, I suppose, ham clubs don't. Everybody has their own shack, their own setup, and their own huge, sometimes collection of kit. When you see some of these ham shacks, and maybe having centralized services, for a community-based club, which sounds quite interesting. I'd be quite intrigued there. I mean, obviously you're well involved in a club in your local area. If there would be a sort of if there would be this type of opportunity to set up a shared shack somewhere, if you like, where all the kit or a lot of kit is pulled into, and either people visit the shack or remote into the shack and then use it remotely using remote control software to pull those resources together.
Yeah, it certainly could be something worth doing, and being in an RF quiet area would certainly be an advantage. I mean, I live in South London, and that isn't necessarily an RF quiet area. I just not got around to it due to work pressures, but one of my radios could be internet connected, and once I get a decent antenna up, there's no reason why you couldn't come across the internet and use it, I assume, the same as me. So kind of, the remote shacks is a good idea. I think the whole makeathon, the build, is we've got to get to these people that are doing things and are interested, and the kind of MacGyver type people, and just bolt amateur radio into what they do and help them, because there's lots of technological things that amateur radio teaches you that's not only to do with radio, but it gives you a good grounding on how a lot of other things work and an understanding. And yeah, it's you could argue for a youngster, an HF rig costs an absolute fortune. Well, yes, they do in some ways, but then there are cheap options into the hobby. Certainly, if you go single band, there are a number of kits you can build, CW and SSB kits, to get you up and running. And I think it's a matter of managing the person's expectations early on. One of the biggest expectations for anybody coming into amateur radio in the UK is they get all the bands or lots of the bands very early on. And everybody new to the hobby that passes a foundation license wants to work DC to light in every mode they can. And quite honestly, they don't have the real estate or the antennas up to be able to do that. So, I think people have to understand. But if you were bolting it onto, say, the maker movement or something like that, and the hacking movement, great idea in my books, Colin.
Mm. I mean, Edmund, what about down the south coast there? Is there any indication that this could work as well?
Very recently, a G4 station, who shall remain anonymous, said to me with his tongue not entirely in his cheek that anything involving wavelengths shorter than 160 meters was not real amateur radio, and if it involved the internet or any kind of technology that wasn't RF, then that made it 100 times worse still. So I can hear now the howls of protest from certain parts of the amateur radio community over the merits or otherwise of remote access. But just because it isn't everything doesn't mean it isn't something. So I don't have any problems with it. People doing what this chap suggests on principle, but I don't know. It's not something I think I would want to do really. even if I was in a rather grotty environment for HF, I think I would still rather go down the RF route personally.
Yeah, no, it always I always shake my head, and I suppose benefit not doing this in video. You do go to shake my head there when you see someone said, "If you don't do amateur radio this way, it's not amateur radio." Well, that's like someone saying, "If you don't learn a language that isn't the one I want to learn, you haven't learned another language." Well, there's loads of them out there. I don't know. I shake my head at that one.
We tend to want to own the equipment, and we get excited about going and buying it and the latest buttons and knobs and that sort of thing. So which is one of the reasons why you won't get many shacks. There are a few ones online that and shortwave receivers around the world you can listen into. So that's an option.
Yeah, maybe it's, as you say, maybe it's that thing, isn't it? In fact, if I've just gone and spent loads of money on this band of radio, then I'm going to tell you it's the best band of radio going, because I've got to justify the amount of money I've just spent on my great big new radio. If it doesn't do D-Star, well, D-Star must be rubbish, because I didn't, my radio that cost me 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 doesn't do D-Star, so D-Star can't be any good because I've got to justify my own expense. Yeah, I suppose it goes back to the same old thing. It's human nature. It's just a shame sometimes when we cut people out of the hobby just because they don't necessarily follow the bit we like. Right, okay, UK guys, this was one for us probably more than anything else here. Ofcom, ham radio call sign availability. Some interesting call sign prefixes are available if you ask nicely for them. Isn't that right, Edmund?
So I gather. I must admit I haven't really followed this particularly closely when I got the M0 in 2013. I would simply say if you've passed your license recently, have a think in advance about several possible call signs that you might like to have, and have them available when you put in your application online, just in case your first choice isn't available. But I suppose taking the I'm alright Jack approach, because I've got the M0 and I'll never have anything else, it's, what call signs are or aren't available in 2017 doesn't really directly affect me.
Yeah, there's some G signs available, Dad, isn't there, on this list bottle accounts? But in some respects, it makes me think about the Icelandic story we covered, I think, a couple of weeks ago, where they were talking about, removing away the discrimination of levels and ages and what it be. And I suppose a lot of the G call signs you normally would associate with people who have got a lot of experience in amateur radio. So maybe seeing somebody brand new to the hobby and young with a G call sign might look a little bit odd in comparison to the rest of the community.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And you've probably heard me on my soapbox on this before. About 12, 14 years ago, I got to know a G3 very well in about the last 15 months of his life. And he was a gentleman living on his own, had no family. He really was isolated, and if it wasn't for amateur radio, he'd have had nobody. And I got to know him, and he was a really interesting old boy. And when he died, or one of the things he wanted was for me to have his call sign. And he said, well, if you want it, I'll arrange it. You can have my call sign. And I thought long and hard about it, because that would have made me a G3, quite an early G3. People who've got that would be at least sort of 25 years older than me now. And I looked at it and thought, two things. A, I've got my M1 call sign. And originally the M1 was the Class B license, because I didn't do Morse, although you can't work that out from the call signs that are being issued now. But I had an M1, and I was happy with my M1, and everybody knew M1MRB was me. And going to a G3 just wouldn't have cut it for me. So I've got his plaque, which says a G3, and his letters, and it sits as pride of place in my shack. But no, I'm sorry, I wouldn't want to change my call sign. In the UK, the proviso was I did change it in the States to a vanity call sign, but only because I didn't like the one they issued, because it gave me a bit of grief from a few people, and secondly, it was pretty much changed almost immediately. So there was no history to me using that call sign, although the call sign I have in the States has been issued many times to many people. So that's the difference in the UK. The call signs don't normally get reissued. They can one to another, but they don't normally get passed on. So there you go, Colin.
Yeah, no problem.
But in your case, Martin, in 2017, having a G3 license would not bring you any advantages over having an M1 license. And M1 is comparatively rare. It's not quite as rare as Mic 5, but there aren't that many Mic 1 stations on the air, so you're likely to your call sign is likely to be sought after as semi-rare on that grounds. And as you say, because back in I suppose it would have been 1960s, wouldn't it? Possibly 1950s even, because call signs were issued sequentially in those days, you could look at that and work out roughly when it was issued, and somebody who was working you or hearing you on the air might erroneously come to the conclusion that because you didn't sound like you were, I don't know, 80 or 90 years old, or because you mentioned something that would indicate you were a lot younger, might wrongly come to the conclusion that you were a pirate and give you grief.
That was also one of the major reasons why I decided not to take up the G3, because the person was well known in South London, and secondly, I thought a lot of people would think I was a pirate as well. Now, we talked about in the previous thing, but he was also known originally in the 60s as being a little bit of a bad boy, because he was doing SSB when everybody was doing AM. So, you know, it was a call sign well known in South London, and he would have had his call sign issued in the mid-50s, I would suggest, which was about the time I was born. So there was no way I could pull that one off, in fairness.
Okay. So, Bill, I'm going to head over to you for the last news story here. And this is a very interesting piece of contact work here. A Earth-Moon-Earth contact using only 10 watts.
I'll tell you what, I'm impressed. Way to go, Dorothy M6BOY. EME contact, 10 watts on 432. Wow.
I tell you what, just proves you don't need a bucket load of power to do stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah, 17 element Yagi helped, but you know, when I back in the 90s, I was floating around at different stations trying to figure out what I liked about radio and what I wanted to do and that kind of stuff. And one of the guys in the town over had a 2-meter VHF EME station, and I think he was using 15 or 17 elements back then with a couple 100 watts.
Yeah.
So this is just awesome. Awesome all the way around. Way to go.
Exactly. And Edmund, Dorothy is part of the Essex ham group, which I know are very, very active, aren't they, in doing stuff like this? So I suppose in some respects we shouldn't be surprised that it's a group that's been able to achieve such a successful contact.
Yes, indeed. And Dorothy these days is probably better known as Mike Zero Lima Mike Romeo. She passed her full license a little while back, but she hung on to her foundation call sign, and which she's still perfectly legally entitled to use as long as she observes the conditions, one of which is power. So yes, 10 watts, 17 element Yagi, firing straight towards the moon when it was pretty much at its perigee, the closest point to Earth, but even so, it's a very, very long return path. And what made this even more impressive is that she didn't announce anywhere in advance that she was going to do it. So the station in Germany that successfully decoded the call sign 100% correctly did it as a random, unscheduled decode of a call sign that he had never seen before. It wasn't even as if the EME community had been tipped off that this transmission was going to take place. And that maybe, I don't know if they had been, perhaps that would have allowed them to, I don't know, guess or work out the last letter if they had received the call sign with the last letter missing. So it was completely done unannounced, and that makes it even more impressive. And yes, Dorothy, very active, belongs to Essex Ham, as do I, even though I'm in exile down in West Sussex. But I don't think this was an Essex Ham activity as such. Dorothy and her husband went round to the station of Mike Zero, and I really apologise, I can't remember the rest of his call sign, and did it from there. Dorothy has done moon bounce before, but using the Mike Zero Lima Mike Romeo call sign and 100 watts. So it's not a first for her to do moon bounce, but it's certainly the first for her to do it using a foundation call sign, and the Essex DX group thinks that this is the first time that it has ever been done with 10 watts, and I can well believe that unless anybody out there knows any different. But big congratulations to Dorothy and her husband Richard and the station who provided the 17 element Yagi, and indeed the station in Germany and everybody involved with this. It's a fantastic achievement. And Dorothy, I know, is made up over it. So very well done, Dorothy, if you're listening to this.
No, I mean, Dad, I think this is also a something for a lot of the M6s out there and the technicians in the States as well. You know, it just proves what you can achieve with your lower power ratings, with the correct setup and getting involved with your local club and your local people to learn new ways of getting further involved in the hobby after taking your foundation exam, isn't it?
Well, two things. Yes, for the UK. But a technician licensee in the States can use up to 1.5 kilowatts. So, from my memory, so in certain bands. So, yeah, they're not restricted by power there. But yeah, I agree with this. I would like to know a little bit more. I agree with everything Edmund said and Bill said on this one. Yes, it's good. However, what mode did they use? You know, I'd like to have known what mode they used. And, yeah, it's great. I mean, to do that. Interestingly enough, if you're on enough high ground, you're over on the east coast of the UK, I wonder whether if you'd have pointed the Yagi at Germany, you would also be able to do a ground wave contact if you were high enough up. But Essex seems to be a fairly flat county, so that might have been a bit more of a problematic. But I know VHF, from the Scout Hut, we've worked into Germany before there. I'm not sure what power, but no, I'm not detracting this one. It's an interesting one. And, I say, good news. And, yeah, congratulations to Dorothy on that one.
Right, guys, let's check in with you, see what you've been up to over the last few weeks since you last been on the show. Edmund, let's start with yourself there and find out what's been going on the south coast of the UK.
Well, up until very recently, I was looking after the call sign Golf Bravo 6 Charlie Romeo Alpha for the second time this year, and it was a lot harder going throughout November. The number of times I called CQ and didn't get an answer. I thought conditions would have improved as we moved towards the winter. I only made about 58 contacts, I think it was, as opposed to 170 odd the first time round. And that is really all that I have done recently. And that was on 40 and 80 meters primarily. Didn't manage any contacts on the higher bands. In terms of over the next few weeks, AO91, the satellite is up there. And I'm waiting for the pile-ups to calm down a little bit, for the novelty to wear off. And I still haven't managed my first satellite contact after owning an elk antenna for probably a year now, which is shameful. But I'm hoping that in the weeks ahead, maybe over Christmas or New Year, AO91 will be the one that I manage my debut satellite QSO on. And I'm just looking at the Essex Ham website, incidentally, and the chap who provided the facilities for the Moon Bounce QSO was Tom. His name is Mike Zero Alpha Bravo Alpha is the gentleman with the Yagi. And it looks like they were using a JT Joe Taylor weak signal mode based on the screenshot on the Essex Ham website, but exactly what flavour they were using, I don't know.
No problem. So, right, Bill, as I say, run up to Christmas. So maybe you've got projects planned for your time off from work.
Tailing on to Edmund's talk, which is good. I actually got through the melee that is AO91, and we had whistlers and we had key uppers and we had someone, typing out tunes with DTMF. But I actually finally, last week got AE0 Mike Tango, Mike, on AO91 as my first AO91 QSO. And, very excited, but not from the lack of trying, because, I actually tried 3 or 4 days. We had the American Thanksgiving holiday and did it 3 or 4 days, and then finally got in and finally got them. And it was within the last 15 seconds of the lost signal. So it was right at the horizon. I was going to lose the satellite, all game over, and I got them. So don't give up, even in that last 15 seconds. Also over last week, I got, TO2SP St. Bartholomew, something like that. Caribbean island on Riddy. That's actually a new DXCC for me. So that was pretty exciting. Other than that, I've been pretty busy getting ready for the holidays. So that takes some time, as everyone knows.
Wasn't, that island also one of the ones that were hit with the hurricanes in the, in a few months ago there in the hurricane season? I vaguely remember that one kind of news story. So it's great to hear the hams are back on the air there and, working stations from there.
I think it was a Polish, de-expedition station going down there.
Okay.
I believe so. I have to double check on that one.
Okay. Not a bad spot for a holiday either. There you go.
No.
Dad, what about you? Projects coming around, obviously, Christmas break and all. What have you got lined up?
Well, I've not had as much fun as you guys. A couple of major things that have gone on in my life last couple of weeks is I start a new job next Monday, which means that I won't be up at stupid o'clock in the morning to go to work, which is going to be a great advantage, which should now allow me to do more amateur radio and a few other bits and pieces. I spent the last couple of weekends messing around with computers, trying to get things sorted, and it got quite strange. I was switching bits of hardware around, but I've now got a separate record machine again. Well, it's not only a record machine, Colin. I couldn't help myself. It's a radio machine, radio computer. So I've got the SDR Play set up on it, and it's working really, really well. I've had some good listings around on SDR Play. Quite pleased with that, and that's, enjoying that. And next Saturday before the show goes out, I'm going to be on HMS Belfast, doing my duty on HMS Belfast, meeting the public, doing a few more certificates with the children and that sort of thing. Yeah, the guys at work, the company I'm just leaving, probably will let me off now because I'm not leaving, but they've got their Christmas due Saturday, and I chose. Before I got the new job, I chose to go and spend time on HMS Belfast with some amateur radio colleagues rather than go to the company's Christmas do. So that shows a little bit of dedication, I think, Colin.
There you go. Hobby before beer. Fair play to you. It's good news you've got time coming up, because I've got to talk to you about a suggestion that came in from a listener about new content. So good thing you got some time, because we're gonna need that spare time you've got coming up. So as always, Dad, as you generate time, I'll find a way to fit it in it. Don't worry about that.
Hang on a minute. The guys won't know this, but back in 2008, I decided to stop watching Formula One motor racing, because Formula One motor racing, by the time you watch the build up, the race and the end bit, it's at least 3 hours. 18 races, 54 hours a year. Sitting in front of a television, those 54 hours a year, I could use to do something else, probably more useful to me. And then Colin rings me up and he says, Dad, do you fancy doing a podcast? Yeah, all right, son. And I used more than 54 hours, Colin.
What can I say? I'm just a man who gives you opportunities. That's all you got to look at. But there we go. Right, let's wrap this one up, guys. So I'd like to thank Edmund, Mike 0, Mike November Golf, Bill November 3, Juliet India X-Ray, and obviously yourself, Dad, Martin M1MRB, for joining us here on the round table. Edmund, have a great holiday break. Happy Christmas and New Year to you. Bill, we catch you for the end of the year show, so I look forward to seeing you then. And as I say, we'll be recording that one actually in a few days' time, so we're getting that ready to be released for Christmas Eve. So okay, because I'm listening for you for the Christmas period. So we'll catch up again in a couple of weeks.
73.
7-3.
7-3. Thank you.
Keep your amateur ham radio podcast advert free by donating less than a length of coax. Visit www.icqpodcast.com/donate now. For all the news, links and information, visit www.icqpodcast.com.
Well, everyone, it's time to have a look at the news in brief from me, Colin M6BOY. And we started with news here of a change of crew on the International Space Station, which obviously means a change also of amateur radio operators. The current crew serving aboard are due to complete their rotation, and a fresh command crew will take over from the 13th of December of 2017. Licensed amateur radio operator Paolo Nespoli, India Zulu 0 Juliet Papa Alpha, and his colleagues Randy Bresnik and Sergei Ranansky will be replaced by crew leader Alexander Merskin and two amateur radio operators, Mark Vanden He, Kilo Golf 5 Golf November Papa, and Joe Akaba, Kilo Echo 5 Delta Alpha Romeo. They're also going to be joined on the 17th of December by an additional amateur radio operator, Scott Tingle, Kilo Golf 5 November Zulu Alpha, Anton Shepelov, and Norris Kani will depart Kazakhstan to join the crew on the 17th of December. So, guys, a great opportunity maybe to work different amateurs for the International Space Station. In Croatia, amateurs there have gained access to a secondary 60-metre allocation at 5351.5 to 5366.5, as agreed at the Radio Communication Conference in 2015, for maximum 15 watts EIRP. The updates the current practice of the Croatian Regulatory Authority for Network and Industries, who are issuing 1-year licenses to operate on the 60-metre band. Further good news for amateurs in Croatia, because they've been given more access to the 160-metre band from 1850 to 1850 kHz with a maximum power of 1.5 kilowatts, and also between 1850 and 2000 kHz with a maximum power of 1 kilowatt EPP. So good news there of additional access in Croatia. News as well from Germany. It appears that the potential new K-Class German entry license has been proposed indefinitely. The DARC have reported that during discussions of the introduction of the new license, it's been postponed indefinitely because it cannot be ruled out that such an introduction could restrict the self-construction privilege of amateur radio operators. So it looks like that new entry class license for Germany appears to be on hold. Well, now we head over to our feature this episode, which is the Art of Desoldering. I hope you enjoy.
And now, what you've all been waiting for, this episode's feature from the ICQ podcast. Hi guys, for this episode I wanted to talk about desoldering. Now, desoldering is useful because when you're trying to remove a component from a PCB for repair purposes, or you may very well be using it to recover a component to go in your junk box. And if it's an expensive component like a filter, you obviously don't want to leave it in a junk PCB. But before we start, let's have a quick recap on soldering. Now, I'm not going to go into it majorly because we talked about soldering in a previous episode, recorded about 6 years ago, believe it or not. But the important things with soldering is that you need clean surfaces. So if your components need to be clean, your PCB needs to be clean, and that helps the solder run when you do your soldering. Also, you need to make sure that your soldering iron is up to temperature. You cannot solder by switching your soldering iron on and 30 seconds later trying to do a solder joint. All right, some of you are going to say, I know the solder guns heat up very, very quickly, but they don't hold a reservoir of heat. So normal soldering irons require a reservoir of heat to just basically make them more efficient when you're soldering. And also for desoldering, if your iron's not hot enough, that's when you can do damage to components because you leave the iron on a lot longer. The correct choice of iron for the job as well is very, very important. You know, it's no good using a little pencil iron if you're trying to heat up a massive earth plane to get a device out. So you've got to choose your right iron for the job. Exactly the same in soldering, and soldering, as I say, is important that you get the right iron. And then what you do is you bring your components together, or your PCB and your component together on the PCB. You heat the joint, which is the component lead and the PCB, and you flow the solder onto the joint and let the solder flow around the joint. You don't just blob a lump of solder on the end of the soldering iron and try and stick it on the PCB, because that will give you a bad joint, often known as a dry joint. So if you're interested in more about soldering, we did cover this about 6 years ago. It's still available on the internet, so I'll leave you to consider that one. Moving on to desoldering. Now, desoldering is an art, and let's say it's just as difficult to do for the beginner as soldering, and to do it well without damaging a PCB or the component is equally important. Now, let's have a think about this. A lot of PCBs today are created with lead-free solder, and lead-free solder, the more modern stuff, is a real pig to desolder. Trust me, it's a real pig to desolder. However, if you're lucky enough, you can desolder the old PCBs, because the 6040 tin lead solder melts at a much lower temperature and stays molten a lot longer. So, choice of solder is certainly worth thinking about when you build something. Now, moving on, if you're going to do desoldering for repair, this sounds really silly, but add more solder to the joint and the tip of your iron. Make sure your iron's got a little bit of solder on it, because it aids the flow of heat. You know, if you look at a transistor, for argument's sake, just run a little bit of solder, touch the solder joints up, and then it will have a reservoir of heat that will allow you to desolder the device a lot easier. Often, PCBs are a greater cost than the component you're trying to remove. So don't try and be a hero and get the component out in one piece. If you definitely know the component is faulty, or it's not a very expensive component, often it's better to just cut the pins out or cut the device out, and then remove the individual pins from the PCB and then clear the holes later. Now, large items like switches and volume controls and things like that on small PCBs, quite easily you can break them up with a pair of cutters and do it the way I just said, by removing individual pins later. So that's a useful one. Then you've got to unblock the holes. Now, this is really where desoldering comes into its own, and I'll talk more about unblocking the holes in a minute. For component recovery, you're very much doing the same thing, but you've got to really start using your brain just a little bit here and determine the value of the recovered component. So if you're going to try and recover quarter-watt resistors, in my opinion, you're wasting your money. You know, they're cheap enough to put a new one in. Electrolytic capacitors, possibly not worth recovering because they do dry out. The electrolytic dries out and they get ESR problems. So quite often it's not worth recovering electrolytic capacitors. But things like filters and specialist devices certainly would be worth removing. So, and power transistors and things like that, which cost money, are certainly worth recovering. But remember, the PCB often has a greater cost than the device. Now, moving on to that, recovery without damage. I've got here. Yeah, it's so easy to damage. If you put too much heat onto a device, you're going to damage it. You're going to damage the PCB. Is the PCB important? And that's why I say that it's always worth having a scrap PCB around to practice on if you want to do either soldering or desoldering. If you want to try out a new tool you've just bought, use an old PCB and remove a few components or put a few components on it. That way you get used to the feel of the tool, and you're not working on an expensive piece of equipment at that point in time. Now, what types of desoldering tools are there available to you? Well, the easiest one is not really a desoldering tool. It's a way of getting a component, a 2 or 3 leg component, out of a board without a desoldering tool. Now, the way you do that is put a little bit more solder on each of the legs, and then you heat one leg up. You either rock it out or you pull out one lead at a time with a pair of pliers, and that works reasonably well. The next one is solder wick. Now, solder wick is something I've never had a tremendous amount of luck at unblocking holes with. However, it stands as a useful device for cleaning up bits of PCB and PCB tracks, so certainly worth a go. Now, what happens is, if you're not careful, is over a period of time, the solder wick oxidizes and it doesn't suck up the solder particularly well. You may need to add more flux, and certainly when I've had more success, when I've had a lot more flux on the PCB to allow it to suck the solder into the wick and clear the component. Other things of use, well, the good old solder sucker pump. Our solder sucker pumps are these devices where you push the lever down, you heat the joint up, you put the solder sucker over it, push the button, and it sucks the solder up into the chamber. Now, these are good for lead tin operation. They're not so good for lead-free because, unfortunately, lead-free tends to desolidify fairly quickly. However, if you can get your PCB vertically, and you can apply the heat to one side, and the solder sucker is on the same joint on the reverse side, that may work very, very well and suck the whole lot out by not removing the iron instantly. So you have to try that one, but that's one way of doing it. Now, one of the easiest ways and cheapest ways I've found of clearing a solder hole is the tap method. Now, the tap method, and this works particularly well for lead-free, is that you heat the joint up. Is after you've removed the pins from the device, you put some solder on the joint or the hole you want to empty. Put your soldering on it so it gets hot, and then you very quickly take your soldering off and tap it, or give it a short, sharp tap onto a desk or a workbench, and the centrifugal force, I suppose I would call it, forces the solder to drop out of the hole, and you clear the hole that way. And that works very, very well, the quick tap method. I've used hot air to desolder components on a board. Now that works quite well if you're trying to remove big components, but it often damages the PCB. You end up melting or burning the PCB, but you get big components off the board. So that is one option. Now, you often with these hot air guns, you can fit more localized nozzles. They have smaller or fatter nozzles, to direct the heat into smaller areas. However, just be aware, hot air can do a lot of damage to the board and ruin your PCB. One other option, which is something that I've looked at but never actually used myself, and a number of people have and had a lot of success, and that's the solder pot. Now, effectively, that's a pot of solder that's kept really hot at the melting point of solder, and what they do is they rest the PCB momentary on top of this, pot of solder, and because the whole PCB or the whole area of the PCB where they're trying to unsolder is molten solder, the components can be pulled off the top of the board very, very quickly. And that I've seen does work well, although it's not something I've tried. The last one I've used, and once again, if you're doing a lot of work, you tend to buy a lot of different tools, and you get the correct tool for the correct job. And it's exactly the same with soldering irons. You choose the soldering iron to do the job you want. A desoldering gun is a very, very useful device. This is effectively a soldering iron with a tip on it that's got a hole in the middle, and behind that is a suction pump. So when you put the iron over the joint, it heats up, the solder goes molten. Usually give it a little spin on the board and push the trigger, and then all of the solder is sucked up into the gun and allowing you to clear joints very quickly. So this works very, very well, but there's a price to them. So if you're only doing a few things, or you're a very small hobbyist and you're not intending to do much PCB work, then you probably wouldn't purchase either the air gun or the desoldering gun. And it doesn't mean to say you're going to ruin your hobby, but the more tools you have in your arsenal, the easier it becomes when you're doing a lot of big work. I hope it's been of interest.
The ICQ Amateur Ham Radio Podcast, serving the amateur ham radio community fortnightly since 2008.
Well, as we enter here the home straight of episode 255 of the ICQ podcast, it's always great to have feedback from listeners, and to drop us a line, all you have to do is go to icqpodcast.com and click on the contact us page, the Facebook group, or even our Twitter handle. But we've got a piece of feedback here from Tim Beaumont, M0 Uniform Romeo X-Ray. And he says, in relation to a previous episode, your comment regarding grid squares news stories, there was a comment made of, so long as it isn't 59IO91 next, please. And he questions why, and can we explain more? He says, nothing worse than when you have a pile-up and dozens of stations want to join in on an event that you get someone rag-chewing and won't let others make the QSO. The whole point of 59IO91 is so that everyone gets a chance to work the station. What would be the point of someone taking part in an event to work as many grid squares as possible if the grid square stations are just rag-chewing? If you want to rag-chew, then rag-chew. If you want to make a popular event, then make it quick and snappy. So that's Tim's view on that one, Dad. And I suppose this goes back to the same thing, and doesn't it really? The fact is, there's different parts of the hobby, different things for people to do, and obviously there's lots of competition, for want of a better word, on that band maybe when a competition's going on.
Yeah. And let's be fair about it. And I'm gonna think that Tim has put some good points forward. And Tim, I'm not picking a fight with you. I think that the whole thing needs looking at. In fairness, I don't think that any of the ICQ podcast team are serious contesters. The only contests I do is when I'm dragged in to do it for the club, and I'm not a contester. I do it to support my local club if and when needed. I think the biggest problem we have, and you're dead right, if you are doing chasing as many grid squares as possible, that's fine, 5-9 and move on. I think where we need to probably have a bit of a look at the bands is every weekend there's a contest. Yeah, nothing wrong with that. More than happy to hear people enjoying themselves. But the contest is spread over the whole band, and you've got the whole band going, and often there's nobody bothers to try and do anything else other than the contest, because the band is full of contesters, which I understand. Now, if you were to limit part of the band off of each of the bands that says it is not for contesting, not a huge amount, but a small amount, I'm sure there would be people like myself that would probably go on HF bands far more and enjoy my part of the hobby. Now, and the other thing is, I think that people will say, well, if you've got all these contesters on and mega amounts of contesters on, they need the whole of the band. But often when you listen to contest stations, they're either sitting on top of each other, or they're sitting like 1 kilohertz away from a previous station, so they're interfering with each other. And I understand why they want to do that, because they want to be close to the strong station, so that when the person moves off the strong station that they've just worked, they find another one instantly. So there's a lot goes on our bands, and I don't want to be the band police, and I accept what you say, Tim. But in my opinion, I'd like to see some of the band, say the 20-metre band, a block of it set aside for no contesting. And therefore, those of us who don't want to contest can have our rag chews without a fear of upsetting the contesters, and vice versa. And, it's supposed to be a gentleman's agreement. We don't interfere with each other. We don't cause interference. I think something probably a bit more formal needs to happen. So a long answer. Kind of agree with you, Tim, but I'm also given the other part of the solution. And unfortunately, we don't have a serious contester in our midst. Now that's not by design. That's just the way it happened. So I'm sure if we had a serious contester in the ICQ presenters group, then they'd be arguing your point for you. So, long answer, Colin, but hopefully that's okay.
Yeah, I suppose it's similar. I mean, we don't have contesters, but we've had people who have competed in the past. And I suppose when you look at other things like sports and things along those lines, in fact, you do have the warm-up area, and the spectator area, and the competition area. And I suppose what you're saying is the same thing maybe with a suggestion here for amateur radio, is that we have that one section of band which is for chatting, one bit of the band for listening, and one bit of the band for contesting in when we do a contest. And if everyone knows that, this section of the band, these kilowatt bands there are what we're going to be using for contesting today, then you say the rag chewers can avoid it, and the contesters can work away, and do what they want to do. It's probably no more than just a case of, policing it. And again, we're trying to grow the numbers, so we're going to have more and more people in those bands. So maybe a little bit of, as you say, gentleman's agreement might fix that as an option going forward. So that's what that's certainly some ideas there, Tim, and hopefully you agree with some of them. But if not, drop us a mail and let us know where we're wrong. We're always grateful to receive the feedback. Well, that wraps us up now, Dad. As we mentioned always before, guys, think of us for donating. ICQpodcast.com/donate. Anything sent away is always greatly appreciated. Check out the Facebook group, the YouTube videos, the Twitter handles at Colin M1MRB for latest news and information as we go through the fortnight to our next show. Our next show is our end of year show where we're doing questions and answers. It has now been recorded, so unfortunately we won't be able to submit any more into that show. But if you've got any questions, pop them over and we'll get them answered for you in the new year. We'd like to thank Edmund Spicer, Mike 0, Mike November Golf, Bill Barnes, November 3, Juliet India X-Ray for joining Dad and myself down on the News Roundtable. And as always, guys, we really hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll catch you again in a fortnight's time, guys. 73.
Yeah, 73.